Few things are for sure in this life, but this is. If we live for any substantial amount of time, we will encounter grief due to the loss of a loved one. Not something any of us ever want, and we all handle it differently. This podcast is to feature those who have done purposeful and meaningful things through their grief. These people featured on here are normal folks, just like you and me, who were thrust into a place they never wanted to be in their lives. A painful place. As they moved through their pain, they realized that something worthwhile, something for the greater good, could come out of the unthinkable. I'm sure that none of them would ever consider themselves to be a hero, but when I searched the definition of the word hero, I found this: a person who is admired or idolized for courage, outstanding achievements, or noble qualities. And that fit. And so it's my privilege to bring you the remarkable stories of these heroes in grief. Hi, everyone. This is Tom, your host for the Heroes in Grief podcast, and the response has been incredible so far, and I want to thank you for that. It's getting out to people, and they're letting us know that it's helping them, and that is what it's all about. I want to make you aware of a way that you can support this podcast without having to spend 1 cent, and that is through affiliate marketing. I've set up affiliate marketing for online shopping. If you do online shopping, then I have links to all the major retailers, most of them anyways, and I can provide them for you so that when you buy online through those links, you'll help support the podcast through the percentages that we get. It doesn't cost you anything more. You just shop like you regularly would on the sites that you love. It's very easy. All you have to do is shop. And that's it. Just let me know the links to the places that you want to shop at, and I will provide the affiliate links so that you can do it. If you want more information on this, you can go to heroesandgrief.com. It takes you to the Linktree page where a video explains it in a little more detail. But you can always email me at tom@heroesandgrief.com, and I can answer questions for you. But you can support the podcast that way, and it's very easy, very simple, and it doesn't cost you a cent. Isn't that great? Thank you. Now here's today's episode. Good day, everybody. Welcome to Heroes in Grief, and thanks for listening and watching. And yes, you can watch on YouTube if you like, and you can see all the beautiful people that I have on my show. You don't got to look at me. You can look at the people I have on. And that's all good. So, and remember that if you are interested in anything you hear on the podcast, you can find that in the show notes of the podcast. So there's links in there. If I happen to not put something in for some reason, then just email me. That's in there too, and ask me for what you need. All right, so that's very simple and very easy, but thanks a lot for listening. And today, very, very special show because I've been wanting to cover this subject, and that subject is suicide, and along with mental illness. And so today my guest is Erin Blechman, and her son passed from suicide, her son Max. And so Erin has done remarkable things in advocacy for that since then. So she's going to tell you all about that. But Erin, welcome to Heroes in Grief.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. And so Erin and I connected with Get Griefy Collective as well. So you've heard about that on other podcasts. Please look into Get Griefy. It is a great resource for all things grief. And there are so many different remarkable people in the episodes or the what do you call them? the what?
The magazines.
The magazines. Yeah, the magazines. Well, I know it's a magazine, but I guess episodes, whatever. So, but our friend Kara Sanchez has put that all together, and it's free online. So go to getgriefy.com. You hear the ads here. We are partnered with them, or I am partnered with them. And but great stuff on there. And they have a collective. If you're a grief worker and you're listening, then you can join the collective as well. And there are so many great ideas and things coming through there. It is hard to keep up with. And I'm having a very hard time keeping up with it, but it's exciting. So anyways, Erin, thank you for coming on. And like I said, when we contacted each other, I've been wanting to get this subject out there because it's so unique and so pertinent to so many people in grief. If you don't mind sharing your story and then we'll get into the great things that you're doing, if you'd like to do that for us.
Yeah, sure. So I am the proud mother of two beautiful boys. They are the loves of my life, along with my husband, Bill. We had Max in 1994, and we had Sam in 1997. And, that has always been my greatest joy, is to be their mom. And I worked a little bit when they were young, and then I worked a little part-time off and on while they were growing up. But my primary role was their mom, and I took that role very seriously. And when I look back, it is very apparent that Max was a very sensitive soul from the day he was born, really. I remember, putting him in his crib and playing lullabies, and he would just cry and cry and cry. And, then when he was a toddler and a preschooler, we would watch movies like Bambi and Lion King. And he was just so deeply impacted by the sadness and the tragedy in those films. And that just kind of continued throughout his life. Very sweet, very sensitive, very tenderhearted. I remember, I don't know if I've told this story lately, but we always came to Naples, Florida, which is where my husband and I now live part-time, because my parents were snowbirds here. And so we came every spring break from the time they were little. And I remember one year there was a guy who was fishing off the shore, and he was throwing a net out, catching the little minnows, pulling the net in, putting the minnows in a bucket, and then using the minnows to hook his reel. And Sam, who was probably about 5 at the time, was just fascinated. He was down there. He was watching what the guy was doing, and he would come back every once in a while to give me a report. And he just thought the whole thing was just fabulous. And Max went over one of the times with Sam, and he came back to the towel bawling. And he was so disturbed that this man was catching these little minnows and then hooking them and killing them to catch other fish then to, eat. And so he just was so tenderhearted, and it was his greatest gift and I think his greatest weakness. As he got older, signs of some depression started to exhibit, signs of anxiety. And so when he was, it was actually his 19th birthday. He was away at college for the first time. And he had his first episode of suicide ideation, and he called 911 on himself. And he ended up in the hospital for several days. And it was just a medical hospital. It wasn't a psychiatric hospital. And he was on suicide watch. It was awful. We went down, pulled him out of school, brought him home. And that was really the beginning of a pretty serious decline over the course of the next 5 or 6 years. He was ultimately hospitalized about 4 or 5 times for suicide ideation. Always checked himself in because he knew he was at risk. He knew he was a danger to himself, and really seemed to want to get better, but just struggled. He had medication-resistant depression, so he tried umpteen antidepressants, none of which worked. And then when he was almost 20, it was just a month before his 20th birthday, he was also diagnosed with epilepsy. He just started having seizures out of the blue. So he lost his license, he lost his independence. It was just a serious blow to his self-esteem and confidence. And so he just continued to struggle over the course of the next few years. And as a result, we struggled along with him. And Sam too, our younger son, Sam was, 3 years younger than Max. Max was his idol, his big brother. And we all just struggled as we kind of watched helplessly what was happening. And then we ended up losing Max in June of 2020, right in the thick of COVID. He was, first of all, he was deeply distressed by all of the political and social unrest that was going on at the time. And he lost everything. He had gotten his license back, and he was actually an Uber driver. And he was in the process of unionizing the Uber drivers in Pittsburgh. That was kind of he was an activist. That was sort of his goal. And so he lost his job. His gym closed because of COVID. He was isolated, and it was just sort of the perfect storm of environmental factors, his own personal genetics, and, disease states. So we ended up losing him in June of 2020. And it was the most devastating thing we have ever experienced.
Mm-hmm. So sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry. And I've heard these stories about COVID and the reactions of people during COVID, but haven't really had the opportunity to talk to someone who experienced the actual situation. And so it's reality, folks. It's real out there. And, the lead up and everything. Yeah, like you said, a perfect storm. Oh my gosh, all the things that took place. And so going on, during this time when you're first finding out about this and experiencing this and everything, so many people, they're armchair quarterbacks. So they sit there and say, well, you could have done this, you could have done that, and all this. So I'm sure you have processed this in your mind so much.
Mm-hmm.
How do you address those things for people? Because they always have the idea that you should have done this or you should have done that or whatever. And have you encountered some of those things?
Yeah, we have. We actually encountered some of that before Max even passed away because we were pretty upfront about his conditions. And I'd like to say a couple of things. First of all, when we shared his depression diagnosis with people, we would get comments like, well, what does he have to be depressed about? Has he prayed? Has he thought about medication? All of to which we were like, duh, of course he has. Of course we have. But it was just this kind of, it just goes to show the ignorance and the lack of understanding and compassion for mental health issues. People kind of think it's a mood. It's somebody wallowing in self-pity, and it's not. It's very much a chemical imbalance in the brain. And that's why medication didn't work for Max. I mean, it was a serious chemical imbalance, and we just could never find the right combination of medications, lifestyle factors, and things of that nature. So we heard a lot of that prior to. And then the other thing I will say is when we shared his epilepsy diagnosis with people, we got a completely different response. It was a much more compassionate, understanding response. Things like, oh gosh, that had to be so hard for him to lose his license. What a blow. And so that just goes to show the way that we treat mental and physical health so differently. And I think that's something that we can and need to do better. So we did get lots of advice, when he was struggling. And then after the fact, I would say I gave myself lots of second guessing. I did that a lot with myself. I always say it'll be 5 years this June, and I can still come up with a new what if almost every day if I really think about it hard enough.
Yeah.
And so I think that we had less of the armchair quarterback after he passed, more of it while he was struggling. But then we turned the tables on ourselves and said, gosh, if we'd only done this, or what if we hadn't done that, or what if we had said this and hadn't said that? There was a lot of that after we lost him. And
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, taking that guilt on was not healthy, obviously, and, really counterproductive for a long time.
Mm-hmm. I love digging into what you just talked about because of people struggling with it and going through it at this time. We're making great strides, there's no doubt. But, and I'm someone who probably lays along these lines where I think that sometimes mental illness or whatever you want to label somebody or something sometimes is used in convenience factors. Other times it's reality. And so it's very difficult for people to balance that sometimes. And they get, but so true, because I've heard people put the thing down there where they said, cancer, if you get a cancer diagnosis, they're going to treat it and you get taken care of. But with mental illness, it's so much different.
Yeah.
And so, but no, there's definitely a physiological. I suffered from depression during my divorce. I never had depression in my life. And I was always somebody who was like, oh, well, that's somebody else's thing or whatever. And I would always pawn it off on something, but it overtook me. And that's something for people to understand, that I had never been out of control in my mind. And I was a very peaceful person, everything. I was a pastor at the time, as a matter of fact. And it blew me away. I mean, it totally overtook me and I was out of control. I mean, at one point I sat there with friends and I said, I need to go to the hospital because I just feel like I'm going to jump out of my skin. I don't know. I couldn't handle what was happening, in my head and everything. And I wasn't crazy or anything. I just was overtaken by this depression. And for a while, I took some mild medications until it was, leveled off. And then finally, I was at the point to where I could take back myself and those kind of things. And I think you train your brain to do that after a while, with the medications and things like that. Would you agree with all of that? I
Yeah.
mean, with what you've been through?
Absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up because I think that, again, it's kind of our black and white thinking. We either ascribe somebody mental health or we ascribe them mental illness. And the fact is we can all experience both throughout our lives. And so, our Max had a clinical diagnosis and I do think that his depression was at a different level, but after he passed away, I fell under depression myself. For that first summer, I could hardly get out of bed. And it gave me a glimpse into what he dealt with day in and day out that I didn't understand, that I didn't really even want to understand because it was so scary to me as his mom. And so, I would say I'm thankful for that depression that kind of overtook me after his death, but in some ways it served a great purpose in opening my eyes to not just his depression, but just mental illness in general. And it's just allowed me to talk to others with, again, greater compassion, greater awareness, greater understanding. And I think we desperately need that. So I'm really glad you brought that up. I think that's important. And I had to take medication too for a period of time following Max's death. And I don't think that's a weakness. I think it's one of the tools that we have available to us. And to shun it just because we think we're somehow above medication is really foolishness. So.
Yeah, I had a great psychologist at the time, and she says, because I'm not a medication guy, I'm not into it at all. And she goes, well, put it this way, your cup is overfilling. I'm just giving you a bigger cup. So it doesn't take everything away and all of that, but it helps you to contain it better.
What a great analogy.
I loved it. And I say it all the time to people.
Yeah.
Now, do you think that because of you experiencing that afterwards, experiencing your depression, do you think it helped you through your grief?
Oh, gosh. I don't think I've ever thought about that. Well, I think at first it intensified my grief. And I think in some ways, the intensity of my grief has turned into a compassion for others that are going through it. So maybe in that regard, and this might be a good time, Tom, to talk about how I processed all of that. Because I was seeing a therapist prior to losing Max because dealing with a sick child for so long is very difficult. And, watching him have seizures was traumatic. And so I just had all sorts of stuff that I had to deal with on my own as a result of being a mom walking alongside a sick child. So I was seeing a therapist and I was established with her. And after Max died, I continued to see her. And so I would go into the sessions with her and I hate to be graphic, but I would literally just vomit words all over her. I don't even know that I made any sense. I don't even know that what I said had any sort of, coherence to it. But so she said to me after a few sessions, I think she was gracious enough not to do this the very first one, but she said, I think it would be really helpful for you to journal. She said, I think that is going to be a way for you to get your thoughts and your feelings out on paper, because I wouldn't even really be able to say how I was feeling. I was just, like I said, just throwing all this stuff at her. And so she said, that's going to allow you to get it out and to name it. And so I did start to do that. And it was hugely helpful and cathartic for me to get all this stuff that was just swirling around in my mind and in my heart out on paper and look at it, name it. And then I started to put some of those journal entries out on social media because I was tired of running into people in the grocery store and having them say to me in the produce aisle, how are you? As if I'm going to get into how I was really feeling, by the bananas.
Yeah.
And so I thought, if people want to know how I feel, I'm going to tell them how I feel. So I started to put these journal entries out on social media, and they were raw and they were vulnerable and they were authentic. And I got really positive feedback. I think because everybody was struggling then. The summer of 2020, I think that's the worst summer in any of our memories. And
Hmm.
so that what happened from there is the idea to create a book from all of those journal entries. And so that was kind of it was a project to narrow my focus. It was kind of my purpose, frankly, for the first couple of years after losing him, because I was journaling, I was putting these entries out on social media. Then I found a graphic designer to help me put together a book that would incorporate some physical beauty as well, because she did illustrations and the layout of the book is just so artistic and beautiful. So, had I not experienced the depression, I don't know that any of that other stuff would have happened, but I think perhaps it was a catalyst, and I've never really thought about it that way before.
Hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
a good question.
What I was, I guess where that question came from was I was wondering if, as you talked about Max and what he was experiencing, that your identification with that may have helped you through that process, of identifying with the mental illness that, or the struggle that you had, and being able, suicide is so horrible, and it's so, you just sit there. I've had friends who have committed suicide. I had a nephew who committed suicide. And so, the void that leaves is different than others. And you're always sitting there thinking about your relationship with that person and if you could have done something. And so I was thinking that it helped you to identify with them better. And so it alleviated some of that struggle of that side of it anyways. That's where
Mm,
that question was coming from, I
mm.
guess. But I think that it did help you, obviously,
Yeah, I
with
don't
what
know.
what came out.
That's interesting. That's something to think about. I I think that, as I said, it gave me a greater understanding of what he had been experiencing, that I didn't understand, and when he was alive, didn't want to understand. So it was almost kind of like a forced lesson, right?
Hmm.
Like, I didn't fully appreciate it when he was going through it. When he would be going through a depressive episode, I would say to him, "Honey, get up," because he had trouble getting out of bed. And I would say to him, "Honey, get up, go outside, go for a walk, call a friend." He had a dog named Emmy. Take Emmy for a walk. Just do something. And I I learned that those weren't just things that were difficult for him. They were literally impossible for him, because we often think that the opposite of depression is happiness, but the opposite of depression is motivation. So he lacked the motivation to do even the most basic things when he was in that depressive episode. And I didn't understand that at all. So
Yeah.
I
That's
would
almost compounding it, right? Where you're
Right,
saying, go do these
right.
things.
These things
Yeah.
would make you feel better. Just do them, right? And so I would drag him out of bed. I remember one time, sometimes he would go to the hospital when he had a depressive episode. Sometimes he would come home. He lived on his own in the city. And he would be in bed until, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I would be coming out of my skin. I was so uncomfortable. And so I would go into his room and I would literally drag him out of bed and drag him on a walk or drag him to the store. And it wasn't like it made him magically better. It wasn't like he said, "Gosh, Mom, thanks for that." He would walk around wherever we were like a zombie. And then we would get home and he'd go right back to bed. And so, going through that depression myself helped me to understand that he didn't want to feel that way. He didn't want to stay in bed. He just literally couldn't get the motivation to do anything different. So
Yeah. That's
that
so
was
great.
yeah, that was a
Great
huge
points.
yeah, that was a huge lesson for me. But in terms of so with suicide, when you lose someone to suicide, it's a very complex type of loss. And I've noticed, being in support groups of suicide survivors, is that oftentimes people are angry with the person who left. who made the decision to die. And we like to say somebody died by suicide rather than committed suicide, because the word committed carries a lot of negative connotations, illegal and immoral connotations, like committed adultery, committed murder, committed robbery. And there's a lot of research that shows that when someone makes the decision to take their life, they're not in their right mind. So even to call it a decision, there's a lot of tension there, because it's almost like they're not thinking rationally. It's not a well thought out, reasoned decision. It's very much a twisted kind of the result of a twisted and disordered mind. So anyway, when people lose a loved one to suicide, oftentimes they're angry at that person. And I've heard this time and time again. How could he do this to me? How could he leave me? How could he, throw this grenade into our family? And so that's really common. And then the other side is to blame everybody else. Well, if only his girlfriend had told us how much he was struggling. If only, he hadn't lost his job. If only I had done X, Y, or Z. So we turn that blame on oftentimes ourselves or others. And I think that's particularly prevalent with parents. We always think we should be able to protect and save our kids, fix whatever's wrong, and we can't. And so I think that the way that we look at suicide, it's so complex, it's so multifaceted, that it just varies by person to person. I don't know if that answers your question or sheds any light on things, but that whole suicide nut just adds a whole different layer to sudden and traumatic loss that is just difficult to deal with.
Hello, friends. I just wanted to take a brief break here in the podcast to make you aware of a very exciting partnership that Heroes in Grief has just formed, and that is with Get Griefy Magazine. I'm going to let their founder and editor-in-chief, Kara Sanchez, tell you all about it.
Hey, Heroes in Grief listeners. Life after loss isn't easy, but it can be colorful and full of possibilities. Meet Get Griefy Magazine, a vibrant resource filled with inspiring stories of life after loss, expert advice, and voices from everyday grievers and thought leaders. Together, they're here to help guide you toward the side of life that's left to be lived fully and authentically. Dive into Get Griefy for free on issue or snag a print copy on Amazon. Connect with us on Instagram at Get Griefy Magazine or visit getgriefymagazine.com to explore, join our thriving small business collective, or discover advertising opportunities. Let's embrace life after loss, boldly and together.
Now back to our episode. I think of this statement you hear out there sometimes, and as we've progressed along a little bit in our society and learning about things, it helps to kind of dig into some of these statements sometimes that have been said for so long. And one of those is suicide is the ultimate selfish act. And you can tear that apart now, because it's like, what you've learned, obviously, it is because of all those exterior things, everybody feeling that way afterwards, the family feeling all the things that it does to the family and everything else. But then it's taking, or it's kind of vilifying the person who performed the suicide, instead. And, what you're bringing to light here, obviously, that's not something to do.
Right.
In the cases.
Yeah. So, suicide creates a lot of questions. And we have questions too, but Max left us a note. And in the note, he said, I feel like I'm in a burning building and the only thing to do is jump. And that is such an interesting analogy, because when we think back to 9/11, when people were jumping out of the Twin Towers because it was literally 5,000 or 6,000 or however many thousand degrees in that building, it's not like they were saying to themselves, so it's really hot in here. I know if I jump out the window, it's going to be better for me. It was not a rational decision. It was things were so horrific where they were that anything was a better alternative to that. And I think that is often the case with suicide. The person is in such incredible pain, such incredible emotional and mental and sometimes physical anguish that they just want the pain to stop. They don't necessarily want to die. They just want the pain to stop. And
That is
so I
great.
think that is an important distinction. And, and so we wouldn't, to view it as selfish, I've never viewed Max's, again, I hate to say decision, maybe choice to leave us as selfish. I know now the depths of his pain. And as his mother, that breaks my heart. And I would never hold it against him to try to end that pain. Because of course I would want to take it from him. Yeah. And another interesting thing, one time, Max was much more open with my husband about the depths of his depression than he was with me. I think he knew because I just couldn't take it. And he and my husband were out one time, and my husband Bill said to him, Max, I just wish I could take it. And Max turned to him and he said, Dad, no, you don't. I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. And so I think that's telling too. It was, we don't know what it was like to be inside his head. But we do know that it was sufficiently difficult and painful enough for him to ultimately decide to end it. Mm-hmm. And, again, that breaks my heart.
Yeah, of course. Now, a little segue. I was going to get to this before, but this can go right back to it, is talking about the whirlwind in the brain, and you were having that afterwards, and you talked about that, and couldn't, when you're talking to your therapist and things, and I thought about when you started the writing process, how that engages another portion of you to observe that, to look at what you wrote and all those things, to bring yourself back together or get your foundation back under you, to where you then started posting them, and eventually came the book. And the book is called My Unexpected Journey, right?
Yep, the subtitle is Reflections After Losing My Son to Suicide.
Yeah. So, that was neat how your engagement with another portion of your body, your thinking, helped you to kind of organize a little bit or get foundation back under you. And so that's a great thing about journaling. It can do that for you, or anything when you're in your the acute phases of grief in the early stages, when you're just out of control and you really don't know what to do or how to handle things. There's physiological things going on with you. And if you can engage yourself, through physical activity or other stimulus, it'll help you to get foundation back under you. So that's really great. Awesome.
Can I add a couple more to that, Tom?
Sure. Yeah.
So the summer that Max died, I walked more miles than I can count. And that was just, when I could get myself out of bed, that's primarily what I was doing, was walking. And the other thing that we did is, after someone dies, it's customary for people to give you a plant or a tree. We ended up getting a bench from some neighbors. We ended up getting kind of a memorial stone. And so we then created a Max Memorial Garden on our property back in Pennsylvania, which was his childhood home. And that was, again, so cathartic, to be digging holes for trees and plants, to be, tearing up sod to make way for the gardening beds that we were adding. That was incredibly helpful. So, to your point, I think, the physical movement is just so helpful in early grief. And again, some sort of creative outlets, like putting the garden together, envisioning, we didn't just slap things down on the ground. We thought about the layout and where we were going to place things, and that creative process, plus the physical exertion that was required, that was all really helpful in those early days of grief.
Because, and if you got anger, you can take that shovel and shove it in the ground and let out some of that anger. Right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, neat. That's great. So the book came first, and then you've got a lot of other things going on. So now you're a speaker, you're an author. I know you're a grief educator as well. We've both been through the Kessler training, which is great. But so what else? Is that the first thing that happened, the book, and then the other things kind of came out of that?
Yes. So the book was released in print in April of 2022. And it was pretty amazing to me that right off the bat, I started to connect with people, a lot of moms around the country, even the world. And so it seemed to be moms that either had a child who was struggling with a mental health issue. So they were looking for some advice or some empathy or, just some understanding. And then it was also moms who had lost children, not just to suicide, but really in any tragic or traumatic way. And as I like to say, anytime we lose a child, it's tragic and traumatic because we don't expect it. Even if it's a long drawn out illness that they die from, we still don't expect to bury our children before we pass. So anyway, it was those two groups. And while I had my personal experience to pull from, I felt like I needed additional tools in my tool belt. So that's when I made the decision to go through David Kessler's Grief Educator certification program. And I remember having a conversation with my therapist about that. And I thought, okay, I've gone through the cathartic process and exercise of writing my book and releasing it. Now I'm making these connections with other people. This is going to give me kind of the education and the knowledge that I need. And my therapist said to me, well, it's also going to be helpful for you. It's going to be therapeutic for you. And I was like, no, that's what you're for. This is purely educational. And from completing it, there were some sessions where I was just wrecked afterwards. They were so emotional and just brought up so much that maybe I hadn't dealt with or hadn't thought of. So it was a wonderful program. And after I finished that, I started to offer these short-term, they're 6 weeks long, online grief groups for bereaved parents. And all of that was intentional. I did short-term because at that point I couldn't conceive of a support group that was ongoing for the rest of my life. Not that I would have had to sign up for that, and I also knew that kind of the attention span I had when I was newly bereaved. I don't know that I could have committed to something that was ongoing. So 6 weeks felt like a nice little bite-sized chunk. They were online because, again, I don't know that I could have gotten myself together to get in a car to go sit in a circle at a support group, but I could sign on to Zoom. And so I wanted to give that option to others. And then the other thing is I pull education into every group. So every group starts with introductions, and then I do a 5-minute presentation on something related to grief. So we might talk about the 6 needs of the grieving that we learned in David Kessler's program. We might learn about the different types of grief. I remember learning that there were 11 different types of grief according to experts and thinking, what? I thought grief was grief. I didn't know there were different categories and classifications. So I start off with a little bit of education, and then I just open it up for discussion. Sometimes the discussion revolves around what we've just learned, and sometimes it, revolves around something that happened to somebody that week that they need to get off their chest. But those groups are so helpful and healing for me because, number one, I'm a facilitator. I'm not the expert. I don't have to have all the answers. So I facilitate the discussion, and it's really a beautiful thing to see the way the participants support and encourage one another. So it's very gratifying. And again, it's healing. It's healing for me to be with other people who understand my loss. And I believe that they feel the same. I am the biggest proponent of support groups because I know when we first joined a suicide survivor support group after Max died, it took us a year to find one, to do that. We didn't even know we needed it. But I finally felt like I met my people. And I think that is so incredibly validating because what I hear from everybody who's grieving, you probably hear this all the time, Tom, is everybody feels like they're all alone. Yeah. And everybody feels like they're doing it wrong because they feel so badly. So they think, because I feel so badly, surely I must be doing something wrong.
Yeah, and there's something wrong with me.
Yes,
right. Yeah,
something wrong with me. And when they're around other people who have experienced the same type of loss, I think we all just kind of go, okay, this is normal. This is natural. This is what it's like to lose somebody so beloved. And I can't say enough about how important and vital I think support groups are in healing.
Yeah, and seek out what's good for you. If the first one doesn't work for you, then go find another. Don't stop.
Amen.
That is the thing, because so many people are like, oh, see, that didn't work for me, and that's done. And then they suffer in their grief longer or deeper than they have to.
Amen.
And so, yeah. And the same thing with the Kessler stuff. I mean, we talk about it a lot on here because I went through that. And so the same thing with helping parents heal, which I'm part of. And, I mean, those things come up all the time. But see, I'm not sponsored by these people or anything like that. So I just want to let everybody know you got to find out your own thing, what works for you. It happened to work for me. It worked for you, Erin. And I went through the same thing. I was only a few months into Jeff passing when the course came up for me. And I sent them an email and I said, now I know that I'm so early on in this. Would this be something that is wise for me to do? And that's what they came back with. I do have background that I put in there that could attribute to understanding it a little bit more, because I was a spiritual care director at a hospice. I was a pastor and these things. So I did tell them that, but that wasn't meaning a whole lot at that point.
Right.
Let me tell you, a couple months into losing my son.
Right.
But I knew that mattered. And so I sent them that email and they came back, and that's exactly what they said, is what you said. And they said, we think this could be therapeutic for you. And that's what they said. It was very wise. And I didn't even think of that. I wasn't thinking of that.
No, you don't approach an educational certification thinking this is going to help me mentally or emotionally anyway.
Yeah. Right? I wanted to help people.
Yeah.
That's what I just wanted to help. That I saw the purpose. It was like, okay, well, something's got to come out of this, right? I want to help people. And that's what I was looking to do. But that was their response. It wasn't about what I was going to, gain on that side of it and everything. And I didn't even know what I was going to do with it anyways. But So very wise. That's remarkable that happened with you too. And it did with me. And now I go back, it's neat now. Grief is so dynamic as you process it, and it continues on with you, that I go back now and I look at some of the things, even from our own, like in Tender Hearts, where you would go through your own grief process. I don't know if you're in Tender Hearts or not, but they have a whole thing where you go week by week, and there's a short little video, and you go through and you cover different aspects of your grief. And so I go back now and I look at some of those things, and because I'm at a different stage in my grief now, it's entirely different, and you process it different. So it's dynamic. You can use it again and again. And the same thing with all the grief educator things. I go back and I listen to them now, and I'm like, yeah, now there's something different I see in that. And so, yeah, it's pretty interesting.
That's good. That's good. Yeah. That reminds me, Tom, if I can share something as you were speaking, it reminded me that, and I think David Kessler talks about this, but the theory is, or not the theory, but the assumption is that grief begets grief. So when you experience a loss, you're not just experiencing that loss, but all the other losses that you've had, or it's tapping into all those other losses in your past. And that, in a way, is a little horrifying, but it's also, I think, comforting, because it explains in some ways the depths of our grief and our pain. And if I can just give an example. So, some of the things that I felt when Max passed away was that it was just so unfair and so unjust that this beautiful, talented, handsome, creative, sensitive guy was no longer in this world, that he was no longer with me. And that was some of the most difficult things that I had to deal with. It just felt so unfair. And, I would look at other families. One thing that still kind of drives me bonkers is when parents would complain about their kids. And I'd be like, gosh, I wish my son were still here to complain about. Like, I don't have that luxury. And so anyway, just recently, within the last month or so, I have an 86-year-old father who is in advanced stages of dementia. And he has been in a memory care facility for 5 years, and he's being evicted from that memory care facility. And for, a whole bunch of reasons, I could bore you with the details, but it has elicited the same emotions of, it's unjust, it's unfair, it's just plain wrong. and it taps into all of those feelings that I had when Max died. And so I have to be able to say to myself, my level of emotion right now as it relates to dealing with my dad, finding a new place for him to go, all of the logistics of that is really kind of disproportionate to what's happening. But I have to say it's because it's tapping into Max's death. I literally can't separate the two. And so I just think that we have to be aware that when we're dealing with our grief, it's not just the current grief that we're dealing with, but everything that's come before it.
Mm-hmm.
And David talks about being free of your old wounds and how that's important. And it's also, even I think when we are, if not completely freer, it still taps into them. It still taps into old trauma, old baggage, old grief.
Yeah. And it's all part of you. So, I mean, there's no choice there. And with your dad, there's complex grief because, first of all, you deal with Alzheimer's and dementia. My mom had late life Alzheimer's, they called it, or whatever, for the last 10 months. And you deal with the loss of who they are and all that portion of it too first. And that's a grief in itself. And then you're dealing with anticipatory grief. Knowing that they're not going to be here for very long and starting to process all of that and everything. And all along the way, all the different things that change sometimes, or they start off at one point and then they progress and things change a little bit more, and independence and all these things that change. And so it's very complex. And, you go through a lot of the grieving process and all of that. That's why I've tried to put it now more onto grief and loss, because it's all connected. All those things come in. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Tough stuff. Wow. So what's going on now for you? What's happening right now? Your website is erinblechman.com. And that is, for those who aren't watching, it's BLECHMAN. Blechman, Erin, ERIN. And of course, it'll be in the show notes, like I said. But erinblechman.com. And what can people find on there?
So my website is a really, really good one-stop shop. So it has information about my book. And so it has a link to my book, My Unexpected Journey, Reflections After Losing My Son to Suicide. I was also the co-author of another book called Stories of Children Lost, which is a compilation of stories about parents who have lost children in a variety of ways. So there's also a link to that book. And then there are links to my grief groups. Again, my grief groups are online, short-term, for bereaved parents. So people can find out some of the topics that we cover and sign up to get notified about the next one. Because again, I offer them periodically throughout the year. And then finally, my speaking. And so I am a public speaker, and I have done what I try to do, Tom, in my talks is elevate the conversation about mental illness, suicide, loss, and grief. So I talk about my Max, I talk about my story, and I really think it's important that we, again, raise awareness, understanding, compassion for mental health, because there's just so much stigma. Same with suicide. There's just so much secrecy and stigma that's associated with both of those topics that really needs to end. So I try to talk openly about those. And then I just try to talk openly about grief, because we live in such a grief illiterate society. And that hurts us when we experience a devastating loss, because we have no idea what hits us. It just, like I said, it feels like we're all alone and there's something wrong with us. And it also helps others to just understand how to come alongside someone who is grieving. And I think that education is very important as well, because we can all do better. We're all going to experience a loss in our lives. And the better equipped we are at understanding that, the better able we're going to be to navigate it. So those are primarily the topics that I cover in my speaking. And I've done a variety of conferences and even businesses. I was invited into a law firm to speak because they had lost a partner's suicide. So just a variety of places. I've spoken at NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. both at chapters and statewide conferences. So there's a lot of information on my website about the different kind of things that I do and how to get in touch with me. So I would love to hear from your listeners. I'd love to hear what they think about this conversation today, and just to hear if they have been touched by any of those three things: mental illness, suicide, or grief.
Excellent. And the speaking engagements, you can do them online as well, right? You could do them via online.
Yes. I've done a couple sort of like webinar type things where I joined a conference out in California and spoke to a group of bereaved moms that way. So yeah, and have done some other ones like that as well. So some are in person, some are online. It just depends. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, excuse me, nowadays with society or with technology, we could, there's so many ways that this could be used. Just sometimes you got to bring it to people and help them to understand it. Like, so say a business here in Western New York wants to have you, they could have an interactive session still on, with technology the way it is now and everything. So that all can be done. And the other thing, the grief and the people around a grieving person and that topic that you were talking about, you and I could do a worldwide tag tour on that one. That is a passion of mine and what I want to get out there with too. So yeah, I consider it a glass ceiling because I tell people about the grief network that is out there, the grief educator and help network that we all know of, you and I know of.
Yeah.
And it's huge. It's vast. There's a lot of resources. And I was talking to a friend who lost his daughter, maybe it's 15 plus years now or whatever. And I was talking to him and he said, I went to a grief group early on and I was at a church and, it just didn't work for me. Excuse me. And he hasn't been doing much since. And I told him about that. I said, there's a huge network of grief help and workers. And he's like, really? Had no idea. And so, we're trying to break through that stigma, and that I consider it a glass ceiling for the stigma. So I keep trying to break through that stuff and get it out there.
And Tom, what you're doing is a perfect example. I mean, I think all of the podcasts that are out there on grief and loss, and some of them specific, some of them more general grief, others suicide specific or child loss or sibling loss. And I just think that's such an easy, accessible thing for people. And it's a good way to kind of dip your toe and find out if this is helpful for you. And if it is, there's so much more that's available to you to help you in your grief journey. So I really applaud you for doing what you're doing. It's important.
Well, I find it very easy. Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's the purpose of it. And I love it because the onus is not on me. It's about all these resources that are available for people and that I can provide. And so it's very easy. Someone sends me a message of their situation and I can find something that fits it. So it makes it great. Yeah. And people like yourself, thank you for raising the discussion on mental illness and suicide. This is an important topic I wanted to get out there for sure. And it's been way too long. This is the 41st episode. So, it's been too long and there's a lot of people out there that can glean from the things you talked about today for sure. And the resources that you have available. So find your people out there, people. That's what it is. You find your people. And, and like Erin said, there's so many people covering the topics. There's other people out there that cover suicide and mental illness too. And so, say Erin and you didn't mesh for some reason. Well, there's somebody else out there. Absolutely. And we're more than willing to help you move on and find that person, because most of all in our hearts, that's what we want for you, is to get better on in your grief walk and journey. So, so Erin, anything that we maybe didn't cover or that you want to get out there that's been on your heart right now, or anything like that?
No, other than the fact that I just, so Tom, you and I are both part of this Get Griefy collective, and Kira Sanchez started this endeavor after losing her mother very suddenly following the birth of Kira's second child. And I so applaud what she's done in connecting all of these grief helpers to each other. But I think the message that is so important is that we heal best in community. We heal best together. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm not sure that if you experience a devastating loss, it's really possible to heal fully in isolation. I think we need other people. I think we need other people to normalize our experience, to understand what we're going through, and just to empathize with us. And none of those things can happen if we isolate. So I would just like to share that message that I believe to the deepest fiber of my being that we heal best together. And so I would just encourage people to find, like you said, find your people, find the people that you can share your burden with, who can help you carry it, because grief is heavy and it's hard to carry. And it's always easier when other people come alongside you.
Yeah. I've heard some people dispute the healing word in grief.
Yeah.
So I thought about that a little bit, because I had someone on recently who said you can heal from grief. Then I've got the people who say you never heal from grief. I think it's a matter of semantics, really. And, if you break a bone and you may have deficits in your arm or struggle with your arm for the rest of your life because the bone healed, but you still have the issues. So that's the way I look at grief a little bit. You're still going to have that residual stuff going on, So healing, I think, is just a semantic thing, really.
Well, and I would never use the word healed. I would never say I'm healed from Max's death, but I can be on the continuum of healing for the rest of my life. Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think it's just I hate those hangups that people get in there, and it's almost like a contentiousness. And, social media has done this for everybody, but it's even in the grief circles, sometimes you see this and I'm like, oh, just stop. Come on now. It's like, use your common sense a little bit,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Amen. Amen.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin. Thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it. It's awesome to, like I said, I think all you people in the collective are rock stars. I come in and I'm like, wow, what's going on here? It's amazing. So,
it is.
And you are, to the grief help world. And so, thanks for coming on, and thanks for being part of this. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom. I appreciate it. And thank you for your listeners to listening.
Thank you for listening to the Heroes in Grief podcast. If you'd like access to any of the links that we discussed in today's show, you can find them in the show notes. There's also a link there to support the podcast if you care to. And there is an email link for me there. I'd love to hear from you and your ideas about the show or what you thought about the show. You really can help out this podcast to get to more people if you subscribe, rate, or review it in whichever way your platform provides. Each week, Heroes in Grief is released on Sunday, so look for new episodes there. Thank you again for listening to Heroes in Grief.